Welcome to Class 2. There's going to be homework discussed shortly, but now we're going to find out if an objectivist lecturer can actually stop talking and take interaction with the audience. Because that's what I promised you, but I found I wanted to do some introductory notes to set the context. And let's begin. We're going to discuss thinking in principles. Leonard Peikoff, in My 30 Years with Ayn Rand, says, I have often thought that the greatest humanitarian service I could perform would be to leave the world a record and analysis of Ayn Rand's mind and how it worked. Ayn Rand thought in terms of principles. Here's a quote you haven't heard before. This is from the biographical interviews that Ayn Rand gave in 1960-61. And she's asked, at what point did you start dealing with philosophy in the form of conscious conceptions? Her answer begins, that was at the age of 12. And it was almost epistemologically a very conscious change. Conscious not in the sense of volitional, but that I observed my whole method of thinking change. You were aware of it, says the interviewer? Very consciously aware. And that I called it, I began to think in principles. And you called it that then? That's what I called it then. Interrupting. Must have been in Russian. I wonder what the Russian would have been for thinking in principles. Interviewer, what were you aware of? Ayn Rand, that I am drawing what I call today wider abstractions, that I was, before that I had very definite convictions on whichever I was concerned with. But by that time, I began an integration. I began to ask myself, if this is what I believe, why do I believe it? What is the reason? I began to consciously construct a chain of whys, W-H-Y. That conscious process of finding the specific formal causes of my convictions began at 12. It was a process of integration. And that's what she meant by thinking in principles, finding the reasons behind the concrete or relatively concrete, more concrete ideas, beliefs, convictions she had, and then finding the reasons for that, and then finding the reasons for that. Now, where does this end? I go to the next slide. Good. We've got an answer. Proof is reduction to reality. So the chain ends when you get to some perceptually evident fact. So that raises a question, what do you mean, reduction to reality? Reality is, people, when I was my more rationalistic period, youth, I was constantly told by people in the know who weren't rationalistic, look at reality. Don't construct these, arguments and so forth. Look at reality. And my question is, where is it? And the answer is, when you reduce to reality, reality is the concretes, which had never occurred to me. Reality is the concretes. And here's a quote that is an unedited excerpt from the fiction writing course that Ayn Rand gave in her apartment about 1958, I believe it was. And she's saying this in the context of writing fiction, but it applies more generally. Abstractions don't exist. Abstractions are only a name for concretes. All that exists is concretes. If you want to present your view, you have to present it in concrete forms because that's the only thing that really exists. In the nonfiction writing course she gave just 10 years later, she said a similar thing. She said, let me give a little context. The subject was, when you write for the popular press, how much objectivism, if any, should you bring in? If you're an objectivist and that's your philosophy, how much of that should you bring into your article, the op-ed that you're writing for some paper, the letter to the editor, or a real article in a real magazine? A full article is what I mean by real there. And she began her answer by saying, objectivism doesn't exist. And then she said, who understands that? And a few hands went up. And she says, the philosophers first. Objectivism is an abstraction. It's a collection, an integrated set of abstractions. So there's no such thing as objectivism. Actually, did I mistake that? She said there's no such thing as objectivism. That's what she said. Did I say objectivism doesn't exist? No. Here she says abstractions. The exact words are, there is no such thing as objectivism. You know, people were taken aback. And then she said, who understands it? So there is no such thing. It's a set of abstractions, and only concretes exist. So if you want to present your view, you have to present the concretes. And a concrete used to illustrate or present an abstraction is an example. Here's my definition of example. An example is a concrete used to clarify an abstraction. By the way, what is a concrete? Well, I'm afraid that it is that which is not an abstraction. An abstraction is a taking out from perception, an aspect that cannot exist on its own. And before you take it out, what you have is something that can exist on its own, and it's concrete. And of course, we can give examples of that. There are examples sitting in every chair here, and every chair here is a concrete. And this hand is a concrete, and that screen is a concrete. So any entity that you perceive and any attribute of it considered as the attribute of it. Let me give you an example. Can you see this green? My hand's kind of in the way. Does that reach the back? Is a certain shade of green? Okay. Green is an abstraction, but this attribute here, this shade of green on this phone face is a concrete. Justice is an abstraction, but the way that Howard Rourke treated Stephen Mallory when he first met him is an instance of justice, and that's a concrete act of justice. So it doesn't have to be an entity to be a concrete, but it has to be individual, particular, and perceptually available. Well, no, it doesn't have to be perceptually available, reducible to perception, because you couldn't perceive the justice of Rourke's treatment of Mallory. But it can be, if you were there and witnessed it and reduced it to what you did see, that would be reducing it to the concrete. Now, Concrete is used to clarify an abstraction. We're going to go through a little semi-rationalistic deduction here. An example is a concrete used to clarify an abstraction. A principle is a fundamental abstraction. The only difference between principles and lesser abstractions is the principle is fundamental in a given domain. So, thinking in principles is clarified by thinking in examples, because an example clarifies a principle, and an abstraction, a principle is an abstraction that's really undistributed middle, but I could recast it in a way that wouldn't make it undistributed middle. If you want to think in principles, you have to use examples. That's the conclusion, not just from a rationalistic deduction, but from observation of my own thinking, and you can observe it in yours. And in just a second, we're going to see someone famous doing it in his context. So to think in principles, think in examples. To think in principles, think in examples. For short, tip, tie. Think in principles, think in examples. This guy, Richard Feynman, world-famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, quite a character. Probably most of you are familiar with him. Here's what he writes in his book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. He writes anecdotally, tells stories in this book, so I'm just picking up in the middle of this story. At all these places, everybody working in physics would tell me what they were doing, and I would discuss it with them. They would tell me the general problem they were working on and would begin to write a bunch of equations. Wait a minute, I would say. Is there a particular example of this general problem? Well, yes, of course. Good, give me one example. That was for me, I can't understand, rather the wrong emphasis. That was for me. I can't understand anything in general unless I'm carrying along in my mind a specific example and watching it go. Some people think in the beginning that I'm kind of slow and I don't understand the problem because I ask a lot of these dumb questions. Is a cathode plus or minus? Is an anion this way or that way? But later, when the guy's in the middle of a bunch of equations, he'll say something, and I'll say, wait a minute, there's an error. That can't be right. The guy looks at his equations, and sure enough, after a while, he finds the mistake and wonders, how the hell did this guy, who hardly understood at the beginning, find that mistake in this mess of all those equations? He thinks I'm following the steps mathematically, but that's not what I'm doing. I have the specific physical example of what he's trying to analyze, and I know from instinct and experience the properties of the thing. So when the equation says it should behave so-and-so, and I know that's the wrong way around, I jump up and say, wait a minute, there's a mistake. Nobel Prize-winning physicist who made fundamental discoveries in quantum mechanics saying he can't deal with the equations unless he has a specific example. Pretty good recommendation for thinking in examples. Here's one other that might pique your interest. Atlas Shrugged is one big example. Art is concretization, meaning art is a view of life presented through concrete examples. Reardon, Galt, Francisco, Kira, Rourke are examples in concrete form, as concrete as she could make them, of her ideal man and woman. So if the Feynman quote didn't grab you, think about what brought you here. An example. Okay, that's 15 minutes of talk, and now let's go over the homework. So I think that's pretty good for an objectivist lecturer. Examples of equivocation. Again, if you're not sure yours is good, you're the person I want to hear from. Because although this one's pretty easy, we need something to discuss. So if you're a little tentative, that's great. If you're dead wrong and know it, that's even better. So who wants to volunteer? Okay, go ahead. Just say it, I'll repeat it.
The laws imply lawgivers. There are laws in nature. Therefore, there must be a cosmic lawgiver.
Well, that's great, except it's good. Laws imply a lawgiver. There are laws of nature that implies a cosmic lawgiver. Now, what is equivocation? If you don't know what equivocation is, you can't give an example of it, as we saw with the restruction yesterday. Equivocation is changing the meaning of the middle term. You remember the S is connected to the M is connected to the P. Well, it's usually the middle term. It actually technically could be the subject or the predicate. You're changing one of the terms into syllogism. There are three terms: the subject term, S, the middle term that connects the two, M, and the predicate, that which is it connects to, P. You could change any one of those, but it's almost always the middle term that's changed. And in this case, we have a law implies a lawgiver. Nature has laws, therefore nature has a lawgiver. The middle term is, or the term that's equivocated on, which happens to be the middle, is law. All right? Lawgiver is not equivocated on. The meaning of law is changed between what two things? Close. Something is legislated and something that isn't. Something that you said is immutable. Something that's simply a description of reality. So it's the metaphysical versus the man-made, right? So the speed limit is 70 on the turnpike is a law of man. Velocity equals distance per unit time is a law of nature. E equals mc squared is a law of nature. It's not really a law, that's a metaphor, right? It's a description of how nature is. How nature is does not imply a lawgiver. If you say a man-made law implies a lawgiver who's a man or a group of men, nature has metaphysically given facts that we recognize, therefore, nothing follows. So that is definitely an example of equivocation, and one that you'll run into in any discussion, most any discussion with a religionist. Who has another one? Okay. That is not good. Very good. Very good. Now we got it. I have dedicated my life to do evil so that a greater good will result. That's not an argument, so it couldn't be equivocation. It's an implicit argument The implicit argument is I have dedicated my life to do evil. Doing evil can, under certain circumstances, produce a greater good. Therefore, I have done this to produce a greater good. You have to supply the missing premise, and that's perfectly all right. I said yesterday, it's raining, therefore I'll take an umbrella. Well, there's an implicit premise. When it rains, it's a good idea to take an umbrella. Or, when it rains, I should take an umbrella. It's raining, therefore I should. So you can supply the missing premise, and we almost never state all the premises of our arguments if they're close to the daily perceptual concrete level, because it's obvious. Okay. But what term do you think would be equivocal in your idea, in your argument, as I flesh it out? Good. No. I'm so pleased. So I'm not, my no is no. Thank you. I've dedicated my life to do evil. Means evil according to a standard of morality. So that a greater good will result means greater good according to that same standard of morality. Here's an example that would be equivocation. I've dedicated my life to being bad so that I can be really good. That is an equivocation on bad. He doesn't mean bad, he means theoretically against some artificial standard that it's fun to break. So by a real standard, I'll be getting what I want. I'll be achieving the right thing. So when in the vernacular we say, that's bad. Now this is a 60s or 70s use of the term. We don't really do that anymore unless you put ass at the end of it. But bad meant good in a cool kind of iconoclastic, authority-baiting way. And that would be an equivocation if someone thought that bad was being used in the same sense. The argument wouldn't work. But it's actually, the real argument there does go through, is valid, because the word bad there means a particular kind of good by the person's own standards. When he says, I'm being bad, he means by conventional standards, not my standard. By my standards, I'm being cool, right? So that is not an argument. I'm very pleased to hear, not an equivocation, and I'm very pleased to hear that. Does someone else have a bad answer? Yeah.
God is love, love is blind, and God is blind.
No, the whole thing is, see, that's bad, because I know the whole one. God is love, love is blind, Ray Charles is blind, therefore Ray Charles is God. That's the whole thing. Now that combines a number of fallacies, but to get to Ray Charles, you have to do undistributed middle. Love is blind, Ray Charles is blind, therefore Ray Charles is love. That doesn't follow. That's like objectivists communists are atheists, objectivists are atheists, therefore objectivists are communists. That is the fallacy of undistributed middle, or if you put it, well, we don't need to go there. That's deductive logic, which I said is not that interesting. But if you say God is love, love is blind, you've sort of equivocated, because when you say God is love, you mean God is some kind of cosmic, ethereal, spiritual, mystical love. When you say love is blind, you mean human love as people actually experience it. So God's love wouldn't be blind love. You wouldn't say, oh, God can't see the fault in people. God, because he's just so infatuated with man, thinks men are perfect and he can't see our flaws. I mean, no religionist would ever hold that. So there is an equivocation if you just break it down like you did. God is love, love is blind, therefore God is blind, or something like that. The love is changed between godly love and human imperfect love, between the two premises. So that would be an example of equivocation. So equivocation is changing the meaning of the term. I think we should go on to the second one, which is more interesting, except that I was pleased that we had some near misses, let's call them here, on that one, because we will draw further lessons from this. Philosophy determines the course of history. I didn't get to the next slide. Philosophy determines the course of history. Something really worth concretizing through an example. Who has an example? Well, let's take someone else. Yes. No, well, I was thinking Augustina. Go ahead.
In the years leading up to the French Revolution, the French people, having been inspired by Enlightenment values, realized that absolute monarchy was not a proper system of government. The Estates General wrote a declaration of the rights of man and citizen as an implementation of John Locke's theory of rights. However, the philosophy behind the system of rights did not protect the man as an individual, but rather the collective man. The 17th article says, since property is an inviolable and sacred right, no one shall be deprived thereof, except where public necessity, legally determined, shall clearly demand it, and then only on condition that the owner shall have been previously and equitably indemnified. Who determines what public necessity?
Yeah, don't criticize it. That's okay. Her example is perfect because it's wrong. It's bad. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. It's coming up in in a moment. Without being able to repeat the whole thing, the example of philosophy determines the course of history is the French Revolution tried to apply Locke's theory of rights, but on a collectivist base. So what they got was the reign of terror. I mean, that's really what you're saying. And condensed into that, it does concretize it a little bit, particularly if you're French or you really know the French Revolution. So it was the French Revolution differs from the American Revolution because the ideas of the French, the philosophic ideas of the French, differ from ours, where we took the British perception-based philosophy of Locke, they twisted it to a collectivist theory of rights influenced by Rousseau, who was a collectivist. Rousseau is the father of Kant. Rousseau is really, really bad. Really bad. So that is a good example, condensed down, of ideas determining the course of history, except it requires a huge body of knowledge to recognize it. Who has another example of concrete under philosophy determines the course of history? Yeah.
The arc of the Dark Ages, the rise of Christianity, the fall of Rome, and then the reintroduction of Aristotle and the move to the Renaissance.
Okay, that's another good and bad example. That's the one I thought, half of that is what I thought most people would say, and it's very good. Either the fall of Rome or the Renaissance. I wouldn't put them both in. You did the arc. That's too much. That's what makes it not good. The fall of Rome, caused by Stoic philosophy, caused by the loss of certain concepts in Aristotle that didn't take hold, like Aristotle's basic identification that reality is the concretes. It was Aristotle who said the most real thing is not the form of the good, like Plato said. It's this man or this horse. So that perspective was lost. The primacy of existence, which Aristotle also asserts in several places, was lost. The idea of free will, which Aristotle had only implicitly, that is, he has statements that imply free will, and he obviously believed in free will, but the Stoics, nobody had ever asserted determinism until the Stoics, which came later. The Stoic philosophy was of ironclad determinism. If you've read A Man in Full by Tom Wolfe, it's based on the Stoic philosophy. Gladiators, the movie, is with Russell Crowe, based on the Stoic philosophy. And it's one of fatalism. Your fate is sealed, you must just accept. That the ethics of submission to higher mysteries began to be accepted instead of Aristotle's logic. And that led to the downfall of Rome. What would be interesting is to get behind the economist's explanation to see philosophy in practice. The economists will tell you, well, they inflated. They ruined their own currency, created chaos, and the barbarians were able to invade. Why did they inflate? Why did they ruin their own currency? Why didn't they act on principle? Because they thought that reason wasn't competent to establish principles. So that would be one. The other would be the rise of the Renaissance, which is directly, that one's a little easier sell because you can directly trace the discoveries and the rebirth in the Renaissance to the places that got Aristotle's text, the lost Aristotelian text, first. For instance, the Renaissance begins in what country? Italy. Where is Italy? Well, it's down there near Africa, across the Mediterranean. And who held Africa? The Arabs. The same Arabs, in some kind of broad sense, Islam Arabs were then in possession of everything but Europe. Around there, everything around northern Africa for sure. The Arabs had Aristotle. Aristotle's corpus from the Crusades, where we had interaction with fighting the Arabs. I say we. Some of us are not of European descent, where the Europeans had contact with the Arabs and began to trade with them, and the Aristotelian writings began to enter Europe. And they entered the closest places to Arab culture, Italy and Spain. Why was Portugal a huge power? You know, the Pope split the New World between Portugal and Spain in the 15th century. He drew a line, and that's why Brazilians speak Portuguese, because their country was on the Portuguese side of the line. Split the New World and the Old World, actually, the new discoveries in Africa and so forth. Because Portugal was trading with, as Spain was trading with the Arab culture, which had Aristotle. And you can trace the text, and you can trace where Aristotelian scholars went. Thomas Aquinas was at Paris, but he was from Italy, and he brought Aristotle to Paris. Well, Albertus Magnus also, who came from Germany, to Paris. And Paris also was trading with the Arabs and trading with Spain, of course. It was the center of Aristotelianism. Galileo. Where did Galileo study? At Padua under the Aristotelians. So you can actually trace the development of the Renaissance of the painters, of the scientists, and so forth, to the areas where Aristotle's text was causing a revival of the Aristotelian philosophy. And then Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christianity and Aristotle, basically simply saying, God created man, so he didn't create a totally sinful being. We are not rotten. He gave us a mind and he gave us a life, so it must be good to use it. God wouldn't have given us a mind unless he intended us to use it. Sure, after death, everything's changed. But for this world, Aristotle is right. Plato's right about the other world after you die. That'll be the world of forms. You don't go there. And sacred theology does tell us to have faith and so forth in that other world. But for living your life in this world, you should seek your happiness, use your mind, and not consider yourself good to the extent that you follow reason. Quite a difference from Augustine and Plato, who said that this world is a vale of tears and man is crooked, sordid, ulcerous, and bespotted. Okay, so that's a pretty easy sell. What would be, does anyone have a contemporary example of philosophy is the determines the course history? Yeah.
I don't know if it's any good, but the equation of economic power with physical force and its result in things like antitrust laws and
Okay, but yes. He says the equation of economic power and physical force and its manifestation in it gives an example of antitrust laws, but you could take just anything. There's nothing to the left other than the equation of economic power and physical force. How does that show the power of philosophy? Because that is a little bit more concrete than philosophy, isn't it? So you'd have to trace that to how come people confuse economic power and political power. What's the answer to that? You don't know, do you? That's why I'm here. That's why I get the big bucks. Why do people think that not being given welfare is equivalent to being punched in the gut? Or even worse, why did they think being offered an item to buy, if they want it, is equivalent to being punched in the gut?
Because they believe that those are rights, so since the government should protect rights, it's a violation of their rights, so it's attacking.
Well, it could be. He says it's because they believe it's a right to have it, so what makes them think it's their right to have it? That would be kind of politics. Why do people think, well, I have a right to welfare? I have a right to be supported. Altruism, yes, altruism. If altruism were true, it wouldn't be an equivocation. It would be returning to people what they are rightfully, what's theirs under altruist ethics, which I've met a few people who actually believe. Some not in this room, but I come across a few in my travels. That's humor, folks. Everybody's an altruist except us, okay? If you're an altruist, like everybody outside this conference, you think that the rightful owner of any wealth there is the person who needs it most. It's their property. So if you're withholding it from them, It's like you have a legal debt and you won't pay it. That's force. That's force. So economic power is physical force under the premise of altruism. There's one other premise that supports the equation of economic power and political force, and that's determinism. If you cannot resist the advertising that tells you to go buy this product because advertising conditions your brain, then there's no difference between an offer and coercion. The premise of saying, well, look, you're free to walk away if you don't want to buy a product, how can that be forced? The premise of that is that you're in charge of your life and you can walk away. But people will tell you, no, I can't walk away. I've been conditioned to buy these things. They usually say, well, I could walk away, but everybody else out there, you couldn't, you can't walk away because you're just a poor dumb slob who's conditioned by, not me, of course, and not our rulers, but the masses, they can't. And then they attack us for thinking we look down on the masses. Oh, the irony. Yes?
Isn't it part of the argument that economic force is physical force, that collectivist leftists know that money is used for corruption and then actually becomes physical force?
He says, don't they say that money is used for corruption through cronyism and use the power of government? That is physical force. That's just a surface rationalization. They actually think that there's no difference between social pressure and physical force. I remember talking about this with a leftist woman, very smart, worked at Goldman Sachs. Leftist woman who said, there's cultural force, which means you can't resist what society, quote, tells you, which really means I had no choice but to agree with my mother when she told me not to do that. I couldn't judge my parents. I couldn't arrive at my own conclusions, so I had to go along with what they told me, and later I had to agree with my professors. I couldn't question them. I didn't have the strength. That's another interesting thing that I'm cutting off my digression on, that people think you need strength to be independent. You don't. It doesn't take 1 ounce of strength to be independent. Okay, let's draw the lessons from this. Oh, no, I have to give you my example. Yesterday, did anybody see an example yesterday? Remember in Yaron's talk about the foreign book sales? Foreign book sales of Ayn Rand's novels are increasing. What he didn't say is that American sales are decreasing. That's why the two curves are joining, partly because sales here are decreasing. Now, they're just decreasing back to a normal level. There was a spurt, around Obama and the Tea Party, and everybody was going galt. Once that died down, we've regressed to the kind of more normal numbers. It's not anything to be alarmed about, although it's not good. But the foreign numbers why are the American numbers going down? Well, I should be facing this way. While the foreign numbers are going up, what's the difference between foreign readers and or potential readers and Americans? Now, there is an accidental factor. It's new to them. It's not new to us. But I don't think that's the real issue, because when Atlas Shrugged was new to us, the numbers weren't as high as they are in America today. So I don't think that's the issue. What do Americans have that hold us back from being interested in objectivism that foreigners don't have or don't have nearly as much of? His first name is John Dewey. There is the dramatic example of the proof of philosophy's power. John Dewey, turn of the century philosopher at Columbia University, came out with pragmatism and applied it to education and created, solely out of his brain, progressive education, which is an American phenomenon. It used to be you saw a distinct difference between American students and Canadian students who were much more literate and thoughtful. But Canada is pretty close to the US, so it's started to drop down and destroy too. But Europe is a lot farther, has a lot less influence of Dewey, has a lot less progressive education. They have an old-fashioned educational system, and they can still think. So if you read Ayn Rand's article, The Comprachicos, and I'm sure almost all of you have, it's one of her greatest articles, The Comprachicos. I think it's in Philosophy Who Needs It? No Voice of Reason? The Anti-Industrial Revolution, okay. Or now called Return of the Primitive, right? One of her greatest articles is about how progressive education has destroyed the minds of Americans. It's taking longer to destroy the minds in other countries as it seeps in there. That's the reason. So now let's draw the lessons. What makes an example good? Well, that it does what it's supposed to do, that it clarifies an abstraction. So therefore, good examples are, and I have certain attributes I'm going to list of good examples, and make sure you follow them, and I'll show you how some of them are violated. Concrete and specific. So if you want to say, well, what's an example of a smartphone? The iPhone is not an example. The iPhone is already an abstraction. Now, I am trying out Android, so, this is an example of a smartphone. Okay? Or if I had my iPhone, which is back home, and I held that up, that would be an example. But saying Android phone or iPhone, that's not concrete and specific. If Rourke had been presented as having no particular personal characteristics, he didn't have red hair, he didn't have no specific height was assigned him, he didn't have a specific way of talking, in that short way that he does, he talked all different styles, then he wouldn't be a concretization of Ayn Rand's hero. It has to be clear. It has to be clear. It won't work for you to clarify the abstraction if it itself is unclear. For example, like most movies are unclear in what's going on or the motivations. Now you see, you don't know what just happened here. I gave an unclear example of being unclear. That was a great example. I said, like most movies, and you're thinking, how, what? So I wanted to give a clear example of being unclear, and I gave an unclear example of being unclear, thereby being clear. It has to be clear-cut, which is not the same thing. But what I mean by clear-cut is that it's not a mixed case or a borderline case, sometimes called a center-of-the-page example. So, for example, and this will be a good example of a bad example, Frank Lloyd Wright is not a clear-cut case of independence. He's independent in his work, and he's dependent, as we learned from Shoshana, in his private life, personal life, other aspects of his life. If you're talking about non-objective painting, there's certain borderline people like Turner in England who have really messy paintings, but you can sort of, in his later period, you're not sure what you're seeing, but you think you're seeing something. That's not a good example of non-objective painting. Jackson Pollock is a good example of non-objective painting. Mondrian is a good example. Now, Picasso's not a good example because there are recognizable entities there. So your examples should not be hard to see. It's the relation to the abstraction. It should be an obvious, clear-cut, yeah, that's it, all right, that kind of example. Simple, crow-friendly. And that's where her example fell down. It can't go on for a paragraph. Unless you're writing a novel, then you're concretizing, through a long story. But an example for thinking in principles, has to be really brief, really simple, really obvious. Or else it won't function. It won't clarify anything. All your crow space will be devoted to what was that about the French Revolution? How did they change the law? If you need all that crow space to get what the example is, you won't have any left over to shed light on the abstraction. Now, it has to be metaphysical, and that's not a great word. It works for me, but by that I mean not parochial. But I didn't want to put a negative in. People tend to, this is a failing of you people. And you've got to cut it out or you're going to hear from me. If you want an example of reason is man's means of survival, you don't pick, well, my tax attorney has to use reason to save me money on my taxes. You want, when the first man invented the wheel, he had to figure out how to make it turn without turning over. Or when the first man figured out how to erect a post and lintel architecture, he had to use his mind and pay attention to see what made it stand up. He had to figure out how to join it so it wouldn't slide off. That's reasoning. When Galileo figured out how to build a telescope, he did that through reason. So you want things that apply, that are simple and basic and not very derivative, like my tax attorney uses reason to save me money on taxes, which is an example of reason is your means of survival, but it's so derivative, so local. People tend to give examples from the here and now. You can use one example from the here and now, but if you're talking about philosophy, if you're talking about principles, you want an example that applies anytime and anywhere. And I'm calling it metaphysical. And it generally helps to go back in history to do that because things were simpler then. It has to be dramatic. Why? Because you're trying to get your mind functioning with the principle. You're trying to shed light on the abstraction using your own knowledge to get stuff out of your subconscious, to mobilize your mental cognitive resources, the knowledge you already have, to understand the principle. It's got to be meaningful to you. It's got to be powerful. It's got to be emotionally involving, or got to be is not right. The more emotionally powerful it is, the more it will draw material from your subconscious. So if it's something that is an example, but you don't give a damn about, you probably don't have much stored knowledge of it, and your subconscious won't want to bring it up anyway. So if you want to be able to think in principle, you have to pick things that are meaningful to you. So Dr. Peikoff, in that article on My 30 Years with Ayn Rand, says that when someone proposed a wrong metaphysical idea, what Ayn Rand saw was her husband being tortured. So she didn't think, well, if that's true, then taxes would go up, and that's bad. You know, the most dramatic, simple concretes that fall under the abstraction, if they really do fall under it, will rally all your cognitive resources to feed information into that to make it live, make the abstraction live for you. So the examples, some of the examples we saw today were violating a lot of those principles. But you need to hew to those principles to make the examples work for you so you really can think in principles. You need to save growth space. You need to care about it. You need to not make it just a local example, but an example that covers the range, or a series of examples that covers the range of the abstraction, of the principle. Now, we'll just have a moment to give the homework assignment for next time. Terms to define. Now, what I'd like you to do is just take a stab at this, because I haven't given you the method of definition yet. I haven't even said what definition is. I'm counting on common sense. So don't spend a lot of time on this unless you get personally motivated because you like this kind of thing. Don't feel you should devote a lot of time. 7, window, war, prize, dignity, racism. So I start easy, and then I get more difficult. And the reason these have been chosen is that you learn something from defining them. It actually illustrates how definitions clarify your knowledge and add to your knowledge. And this is the end of class 2. Okay, let's take questions for 1 minute.
The Renaissance, the fall of Rome, those are not concretes. Those are abstractions.
Good point.
And in Feynman in another place talks about examples with mathematicians where he constructed a mental ball, turned it green, put hairs on it. So he had a hairy green ball that was not an object in reality. It was a mental construction entirely.
Yeah.
So aren't examples really more like relatively concrete rather than necessarily concrete as such?
Interesting idea. You could all hear him because he had the mic, right? Yeah, the Renaissance by itself and the Dark Ages, they are not specific. That's like the iPhone. And you would have to concretize it through, in my mind, I was thinking of specific paintings. You would have to range over a number of things. Galileo rolling the balls down the inclined planes to get S equals 1/2 AT squared. If you fill them in, then you got concrete specific. But I think you're right. You don't really have to do that. You have to get to a level of concrete and specificity, and I'm going to ask Gene, who does this also, whether that's true. You have to get to a level of concreteness and specificity that works to clarify the example for you. The other point you made was?
He made an image of a hairy green ball, I believe it was, as a invented concrete. It wasn't there was no real
but
hairy
invented
green ball
concretes
anywhere.
are fine. In fact, you and I believe they're great. That's what
Absolutely,
we call thought
sure.
experiments, right?
Yes.
Thought experiments. Actually, it was Einstein who coined that. And I left that out, so I'll end with this. Einstein came up with the theory of relativity by imagining what it would be like to ride on a light beam. So that is a thought experiment with concretes that led to the theory of special relativity. So that's the power of this thing. They do not have to be real examples. Atlas Shrugged never happened. Maybe you didn't know that, but those are invented concretes, but it still works. The question is, does it work to clarify the principle? Thank you very much.